I thought I was going to die that night, not because of the guns or the sickness or the men who lurk behind bars, but because of hunger. Hunger, it's not like pain. It doesn't flare up and then go away. It's a slow, dull knife that cuts into my belly, little by little, until I can't tell the difference between hunger and me. The wind from the north tore the last patch of cloth from my shoulder. A light rain fell, as if the sky were tired and didn't want to cry a proper storm. I stood still in the alley behind the Beckley Inn, where the pale yellow light from the kitchen window made streaks of light on the cracked stone. My boots, one high, one low, were soaked in cold mud. My hands were shaking, not from cold, but from fear and hunger. God, I was so hungry I could hear my stomach growling like the stirrings of a demon. The smell of soup wafted through the crack in the door. Meat, vegetable, broth, fresh bread. Luxuries had been lost to me 14 days earlier when I had chewed the last crumb of the dry bread my father had left in my pocket. I have nothing left. No family, no name to remember. No place to return to. All I have left is an empty stomach and two hands that know how to open wooden locks. I was not born to steal. I was a tiller's daughter, the kind of person who believed in God in the harvest. But faith did not hold the land when the army came. My father died because he refused to leave his land. My mother died of a cough that could not be cured. And me, I still breathe, still walk, still live, as if no one had told me that I should have died with them. I put my hand on the back kitchen door, my fingers so cold I could barely feel them. I pushed gently. The hinges creaked a little. My heart jumped like a sparrow meeting a hawk. I held my breath, listening. There was no sound inside, only the trickle of water from the old trough on the porch. Inside, on the wooden table near the fireplace, there was a half-baked loaf of bread, cold. I looked at it like a dying man looks at the sun. I saw it before my eyes in every detail. The cracked crust, the soft inside, the inviting sheen of oil from the crust. Just a little bit, just half a piece, just to last another night. I stepped in like a ghost, my feet making no sound. My stomach growled as if it were being pulled by a saw. My hand reached out, trembling, inches from touching. "Take it," a deep voice said from the dark corner. "And they will beat you." I froze. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Silently, as if he had grown out of the shadow of the fireplace itself. His hair was long and black, tangled by wind and dew. His dark leather jacket was as old as the dirt of the West. He was unlike anyone else in town. I knew it. "You're a Comanche." His eyes, the color of burnt wood, deep and silent as a moonless night, stopped at my hand. Not angry, not contemptuous, just something that made me lower my hand. "And let them beat me," I said. My voice as hoarse as dry sand. "As long as there is food in my stomach." He didn't answer right away. He looked at me for another beat. Then he did something I never expected. He took off his coat. Slowly, calmly, he walked over, and as if I were a lost little sister, he placed the coat over my shoulders. Heavy, smelling of wood smoke and horses, heart-wrenchingly warm. Then he took the loaf, broke it in half, and gave one half to me. I was speechless. I just stared at the cake like someone who had found gold. My hands were shaking as I held it. I didn't mean to cry. I'd cried my eyes out since I was 15. But that day, the tears came, not out of pity, but because for the first time, someone looked at me as something other than a walking corpse. "What about you?" I asked. "You are colder than me," he replied, his voice as deep as tree root. I took a bite of the cake, chewing slowly, holding it in my mouth like a prayer. He turned and walked out the door. "Wait." I called. "What's your name?" He stopped, not turning back. "Ours." Just one word, short as the wind through the grass, but I know I won't forget it. "Ours." I sat in the dim light, my jacket wrapped around me. Every time I breathed, I felt my chest warm. Not because my stomach was full, but because someone who owed me nothing had chosen to stand by me instead of turning away like everyone else. And on that rainy night, in the middle of a town full of red soil and closed hearts, I no longer felt completely invisible. I slept under the porch behind the inn for 3 nights. Just a blanket Naya's coat, really, and a bed of hay I'd collected from the old stables. Every morning I'd wake up with frost in my lungs and a piece of bread in my pocket, but I'd never felt so warm. Not because of the bread, but because someone had once given it to me without asking. On the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not hurried, not calculating. As if the land knew the person's footsteps, I looked up and saw Nia, standing silently under the eaves of the woodshop across the street. His shadow stretched out against the wall like a silent tree in the middle of a field. I don't know why he stood there. Maybe because of me, maybe because of the coming rain. But his eyes, when they met mine, were not shut, not avoiding, just quiet, as if he knew I would still be sitting there. I ate the last piece of cake, chewed slowly. The morning air was chilly, but something warmed me not from the fire, but from not being alone. The next morning, I sat on the steps, hugging my knees, staring into space. Nia appeared again, leaning against an old wooden pillar a few feet away from me. I looked at him, then said, "You don't talk much, do you?" He shrugged slightly. No nod, no shake. A silent agreement. I said, my voice dry as sand. "Until they took my land. Until the fever killed my parents," I paused, not because of the pain, but because it had been so long since I had told anyone about those things. "We had a garden at the bottom of the valley." I continued, "chickens, a cow, and the hill my father planted horseradish on every spring." I laughed, the sound fading into the wind. "Then one day they told us we had never had rights to it. The land was nobody's unless it had a name on it." Nia said nothing, but he didn't leave either. His eyes followed me, not judging, not pitying, just present. And that was enough. "My mother died in the church's altar," I whispered. "I buried her with a soup spoon behind the chapel. No one asked where I went after that." I bowed my head. "I'm still going. It's just, there's nowhere else to go." A long silence like the valley between two mountain ranges. Nia was still standing there. I didn't need to look to know. The wind blew through my hair, crisp, but I wasn't cold. Finally, he left. Not a word, not a sound of boo. But his footprints in the mud were proof that he had stood there with me and never looked away. That night, I returned to the porch, expecting nothing but familiar silence. But as I lay back, my hand brushed against something unfamiliar under my shirt. I sat up abruptly. A small cloth package. I opened it. A bag of rice, a small bone knife wrapped in moisture-proof leather, and a hand-carved piece of wood, the only engraving. Enough. I didn't cry. I just clutched the package to my chest, as if holding onto a part of me that I thought had long since died with my parents. On the other side of town, Nia was probably still working in the workshop, silent as ever, but I knew he had told me through the rice, the knife, and the wood that I was no longer invisible, and perhaps, for the first time in many winters, I believe so too. I don't know who first called Nia the wood ghost. Maybe it was the baker, or a drunken blacksmith, but the name spread through town like wind through a burnt field. To them, he was a ghost, appearing at sunset, working in silence, away from it all. As for me, you were the first person to put a piece of rice in my hand without asking anything. 3 weeks after that first night, I began leaving him little packages, a piece of stale bread, a piece of peeled wood, sometimes just a stone I had carved with my fingernail. I left them near the sawmill where he worked each night, and then walked away. He never said a word in return, but the next morning, the package was gone, and I knew the silence was my thanks. The town hasn't changed, but I got a job at the Beckley Inn, sweeping floors, washing dishes, wiping table. People looked at me like I was trash. One mother pulled her child away from me when I walked by. I heard them say behind my back, "That girl eating with the Indian." They didn't know I wasn't eating at all. We were just sharing life. I didn't object. I worked hard. Every night when I came home, I stopped by the wood shop and left a part of myself on his desk. One misty morning, I arrived earlier than usual. He was chopping wood, rhythmically and vigorously. I put the package of cakes on the table and turned to leave as usual. "Thanks," he said. I froze. His voice was low and dry, like the wind in a canyon. I turned my head, not daring to smile too much. I just nodded slightly. From that day on, the silences between me and him were no longer silences. They became companionship. We started rebuilding the old shack on the edge of town, the decaying remains of a trapping station. Nia did the woodwork. I patched the corrugated iron roofs. I'd never held a hammer before, and my fingers bled countless times. But I never gave up. In the evenings, we lit a fire, cooked burnt cassava roots, and munched on wild herbs he picked. I learned little by little how to light a fire in the wind, how to read fox tracks in wet soil, how to tie rabbit traps with sinew he made from old leather. We didn't talk much, but the look in his eyes as he showed me how to use a knife patient Trusting was enough to tell me I was learning more than survival. I was learning to be human again, from scratch. One night, I sat by the fire, kneading an iron pot, and turned to him and asked, "Give me one word, your word." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said softly, "Natsu, Natsu." I repeated, enjoying the way the sound stuck to my tongue like honey. "What does that mean?" "Resilient," he said, or stubborn. "Depends on the user." I laughed. "I take both." The next morning, I started planting potatoes behind the hut. A few tubers, a few beans, and a small row of onions. I watered them every morning, using the tin can I borrowed from the inn. He had carved a flute from pine. He had never played it, but I saw him stroke the holes as he sat alone, as if remembering a lost song. Every day, I feel a little fuller, not in the belly, but in the heart. I used to be invisible, a shadow among hurried footsteps. But now, every night, when he puts wood in my hand, when he lets me fan the fire, when his eyes linger on the scar on my forehead without asking, I am seen, not as someone who needs saving, but as someone who can exist with someone and live together. I left the inn just as it was getting dark, carrying a bucket of gray water mixed with ash to dump in the trough behind the stables. The path behind the inn was narrow and dark, the ground as soft as mud from the rains of the past few days. I kept my head down, avoiding the dirty puddles that reflected the dim lights of the nearby tavern. I was almost at the trough when I heard a snicker up ahead. 3 shadows parted from the forge wall like hyenas scenting blood. Well, a voice said. It was high, dry, and sharp as claws on glass. "If it isn't the Indian's pet rat, then who is it?" I paused, gripping the bucket handle. Goosebumps rose on my hands. My heart skipped a beat. The one in the middle was tall and lanky, with hair as blonde as burnt straw and small and vicious-eyed. The other 2 were shorter, with round faces that had never known responsibility, only spite. They weren't drunk, but the look in their eyes was familiar. A mixture of power, fear, and the habit of stepping on the weak. "I'm just going to get some water," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Where to?" "To the buffalo hide hut." Another guy grinned, stepping forward and knocking the bucket of water out of my hand. Water splashed all over the hem of my skirt. I stepped back, my feet slipping on the wet ground. "I heard you cooked for him." "Offered him rabbit meat." "Are you trying to marry him?" The third guy laughed, slapping his friend on the shoulder. I shivered, but not from the cold. I bit my lip. "He's better than you." The blonde's face darkened. "Say it again." I squeezed his hand, eyes never leaving his. I said. He shoved me. I fell backwards, my hands clawing at the ground, my head hitting the old brick edge of the wall. The pain shot up to the back of my neck. I tried to sit up. My mouth tasted salty. And then footstep, deep, slow, steady, like the beating of an old drum in the middle of an empty step. All 3 of them turned around. A figure quietly stepped out from the dark corner of the wood shop. Ours. He held no weapon. He was not angry. He did not scream, just standing there, square-shouldered, his patchwork jacket speckled with sawdust. His eyes met mine and I knew I wasn't alone. He looked at the other 3. His voice rang out low, even, like the sound of earth cracking in a drought. "She's not stealing," he said. "She's surviving." There was a long silence. No one moved. He took another step forward. "She doesn't belong to you," he continued. "And this street doesn't belong to you either." No threat, no intimidating gesture, but something in his demeanor made all 3 of them take a step back. The blonde glanced at the other 2. His lips pressed together, then turned on his heel. He said nothing. The other 2 followed, muttering like dogs with their tails between their legs. I was still sitting on the ground, my heart in turmoil. My face was wet. I didn't know if it was from the blood or the rainwater seeping up from the ground. Nia approached, silently extending her hand. I took it. His hand was warm and strong. He pulled me up without saying a word. "Sorry," I breathed, my voice breaking. "Don't," he said. "They hate us." "I know, but you still stood up. Because someone should." Just 4 words, but the whole world in them. That night, the news spread like wildfire through town. No one said anything out loud, but everyone knew. The next morning, I walked through the market with my head down, but no one bumped into me. No one made fun of me. I am not respected, but I am not despised anymore. And you, people still call you the ghost, but now they speak more quietly, and no one dares look you in the eye. He didn't take anything with guns. He just stepped out, and they backed away. And for the first time, I saw this town silent. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, with a new coat and boots that were free of the dust of the land. I first saw him in the Beckley Inn, ordering black coffee without sugar and paying with a coin from Fort Killian. His fingers wore silver rings, and his movements were dry, as if he had been more accustomed to wielding whips than human hand. His name was Horace Bell, lieutenant, retired. But the way he looked around, nodding at the innkeeper with the eyes of someone who had commanded an execution, told me the power within him was not dead. It was just sleeping. No one asked him why he came. But half a day later, the whole town knew. Bell wandered through the alleys, questioning blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and stable hands. His voice was soft, but the orders behind it were as sharp as a whip. Does he have a tattoo of 3 feathers on his wrist? He is tall, dark eyes, and doesn't talk much. He is looking for someone. I heard the story while I was carrying water at the well. He attacked trains, a boy whispered to his friend, stealed all the bones from the ancient tombs and reburied them. I heard he killed an officer. The other shuddered. I dropped the bucket of water. My heart was as cold as frozen iron. That night, the smell of smoke woke me up before the sound of the wind. I jumped up. My heart stopped beating. The fire dyed the sky orange behind the pine trees. Hut. I ran like a madman. My feet slipped on rock. My hands clawed at the ground. When I got there, all that was left was smoke and ash. The fire had licked the thatched roof and burned the mud walls. My potato garden was ashes. The wooden flute broke in two. The patched shirt he had worn was still on the rock, smoldering. He stood in the ashes, motionless, not crying, not shaking, but not whole either. I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't turn around. "It's Bell," I whispered. I heard him talking. "He knows." He nodded slightly. "We have to go." He picked up the broken piece of flute and stared at it as if he were seeing fire for the first time. "Where are we going?" "Claire, where is the fire not following?" I knelt down in front of him, making him look me in the eyes. "We can go to the river. I have a map. We have a way out to the west." He shook his head slightly. "I carry fire everywhere." "That's not true." I squeezed his hand. "They burned down our house, not because you did anything wrong, but because you dared to live as if you were allowed to exist." He closed his eyes. His voice dropped. "I'm tired," I whispered, almost pleading. "Me too, but I'm more tired of losing everything I love." He opened his eyes. The vision was no longer cloudy, just blank. Then slowly, a ray of light passed through like ashes in the wind. He nodded. That night, we sat on the edge of the forest, holding hands, not saying anything. It felt like the world was about to swallow us up. But at least this time, we chose to stay. They arrived before dawn. 4 men, rifles slung over their shoulders. Bell led the way, walking as if leading a hunting party. We were at the riverbank, where he used to wash his hands after each sawing session. "Stand up," Bell ordered. He stood, slowly, majestically. They tied him up. No one said a word. People poured into the streets when they heard the news. A boy threw a stone, missed. No one stopped him. They took him to the old stables behind the church and shackled his hands to a post. There was no sentence. There was no law. Only the flames of long-standing hatred remained. And the villagers, now needing no reason to do evil. I was stopped at the door of the cage. "Go home." "Girl," a guard growled. "Before they call you an accomplice." I looked him straight in the eye. "I am." He was speechless. Then he turned away. I stood there until it rained. Ashes from the hut were still in my hair. Mud stained my skirt. But I did not leave, because in my heart, the fire still burns, this time not to burn, but to ignite something that no one can put out. The small square in front of the church had never been as crowded as it was that morning. The sky was dark and cloudy. The wind was stinging, carrying the smell of wet straw and anger. People came in groups, carrying sticks, iron pots, some with knives on their belts, as if going to war. Their eyes were red, not from lack of sleep, but from waiting for an execution without a trial. They don't call it execution. They call it cleansing. Nia was tied up in an old stable, her chains tied around a rotten wooden post. Every time the wind blew, the door banged against the wall like a funeral drum. I stood in the crowd, my dress patched, my arms clutching a worn leather notebook, the last thing my father had left me. They did not see me as a person, only as a piece of trash standing between them and justice. An aunt on the right shouted, "That guy once robbed a train." I heard it with my own ears. "And killed the officer," added the neighbor. "What else is needed? Hanging is light." They spoke with conviction. It was as if the fire within them had touched the wick of gunpowder. I don't wait anymore. I walked up the steps of the post office where all the mail had come and gone, where life had been recorded, and now a death was about to begin. I took a deep breath, then I spoke, without shaking. Before you hang a man, I said, hear what he is accused of. The crowd fell silent. The wind blew through my hair, lifting my skirt from my knees. I held up the notebook, my hand shaking slightly. My voice rang out in the ash-dry silence. This book belonged to my father, Captain Everett Warren, who served in the Red Plains campaign and built Fort Killian. Someone in the crowd whispered, a good man. I nodded, eyes unblinking. He thinks so. But here's what he wrote. I opened the bookmark page and read, we took the hillside without firing a shot. There were no warriors to be seen. Only old men and children. We burned tents, food, even graves. The smell of victory mingled with ashes and weeping. A woman nearby bowed her head. Someone cleared his throat, but said nothing. I turned the page. This land would not be ours by fire. Perhaps we burned the wrong man. The wind still blew, but this time it didn't roar like before. It just whistled through my fingers, as if whispering something from long ago. I looked straight at them. You think you know who he is? You think you know what happened? But no one ever asks. No one ever listens. I walked down the steps, but I was there. I heard him talk about the skeletons on display, about the laughter of children knocking on the skulls of his ancestors. I heard him say he didn't want to shoot anyone, just wanted to take them back to where they belonged. I walked to the front of the cage. They burned our houses, I said, my voice low, because we dared to live as if we had rights. No one argued back, but no one removed the chains either. I turned back to the crowd. You can't extinguish a man by tying his hands, I whispered, especially when his heart is still intact. Silent, but it was not the silence of anger anymore. It was the silence when a strange door opened slightly. Someone peeked through, not daring to enter. An old man leading a horse lifted his hat. A little girl tugged at her mother's skirt, asking something in a very low voice. No one said, let him go, but no one shouted, hang him anymore. And in Nia's eyes from within the darkness of the stable, I saw something strange. Not hope, not forgiveness, just recognition. You see me. Not just someone who has been hungry, but someone who stands in the midst of the hunger of a generation and says, enough. It started to rain in the late afternoon, the kind of rain that comes with no warning from the west, no thunder, no lightning, just a heavy, falling sky, then water pouring down like someone tearing the heavens apart. The two guards at the stables retreated to the porch, hunched over in their wet shirt. One of them opened the bottle of wine I had thrust into his hands that morning. To keep you from getting cold, I smiled sweetly, my hand shaking slightly, hiding the bottle of wine, which had been soaked in the taste of opium from the drug store behind the tavern. Now the medicine is starting to take effect. The first man fell heavily to the side, the bottle slipping from his hand and falling to the ground. The other man was a little more sober, mumbled a few words, and then leaned his head against the wall like someone who had drunk too much. I didn't wait any longer, running like a young fox in a storm, skirt sweeping mud, heart pounding. In my hand was a small axe. The handle was cracked, but the blade was still sharp. The stable door screeched as I broke the chain. The axe blade jammed into the lock, gripping tightly, and I gritted my teeth and pushed with all my might. There was a crack, and the chain broke. The door flew open. Nia raised her head, eyes wide. He couldn't believe it. Go, I whispered, hastily cutting the ropes, binding his wrists with the bone knife I had hidden in my shirt. They're drunk. He stood up, staggering. His body was bruised and emaciated, but his eyes were alert, like someone who had just come back to life. We said nothing more. No need. Run. On the path behind the church, the mud dragged at my feet with each step. The wind tore through my ears like a whip. The rain poured down like a waterfall. Cold to the marrow, my hair was matted. My eyes stung, but I didn't stop. In the distance, oil lamps flickered in the houses. Maybe someone would hear. Maybe the alarm would go off at any moment. Nia walked beside me, limping but not slowly. Sometimes I almost slipped. He pulled my hand. Sometimes he fell. I helped him up. The riverbank appeared behind the pine trees. The water was black and roaring in the storm. Across the river, I pointed. There's a path up the hill on the other side. Nia nodded. Taking off his jacket, the one he'd given me that first night, now frayed and patched, he tied one sleeve around a tree root that hung down into the river and wrapped the other end around his arm. Then without hesitation, he jumped. I counted the seconds, my heart breaking as I saw his head emerge from the waves. He struggled, then clung to the roots. I prepared to follow, but my foot slipped. A swish. I fell. The river water licked my skin like a knife. I struggled and screamed, but my voice was drowned by the wind. My eyes opened, and in a flash of light, I saw Nia rushing toward me. His hand grabbed mine. Drag. Push. He hissed in a ragged breath. I struggled to tread water. The mud rose up to my neck. My dress clung to my legs. Then I saw the ground. Cold, muddy, and hard. We collapsed onto the shore, panting, shaking. I lay there, my skin purple, my hair matted with river debris. Nia wrapped the torn shirt around me, tying it with the same rope she had just untied. It fits, he whispered. I laughed, a broken laugh mixed with tears. I still have it, because I still have you. The rain was still pouring down like a roaring thunder. But in that cold, I felt warmth, not from his shirt, but from his hand holding mine. We don't know what lies ahead, but we do know we have made a choice, not to run out of fear, but to live for each other. That night, in the deep forest, under a tarp lined with pine needles, two people who had been rejected by the whole world looked at each other, not with tears, but with something like a promise. We will not let go. We arrived at that village early in the morning before the sun had even risen. The mist still covered the forest shoulders. The ground underfoot was soft as a memory, and the small houses breathed softly on the hillside as if someone had placed them there with two hands, not with hammers and nails. No one asked where we came from. No one needed to know. There, everyone has come with empty hands, a stained name, or a past no one wants to talk about. There, the past is not an accusation. It is a rotten stump. Everyone has it, but no one stays there forever. We started over with scrap wood, crushed stone, and lots of silence. The little hut nestled against the edge of the woods, the walls rickety but sturdy. I planted some seeds by the door, corn, beans, a few sprigs of wildflowers. Nia built the bed frame with her bare hands, carving each slat with the bone knife I'd used to cut his ropes. In the morning, I teach children to put letters together. They chattered, mispronounced, wrote backwards, and laughed like the sun. One pointed at the word bread. I wrote on the ground and exclaimed, "It's like the one Uncle Nia always wears." I laughed, feeling light as smoke. That was right. The cake was still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth, always arriving after school, like an unspoken promise. In the afternoon, I swept the porch, dried my clothes, and washed the radishes in the backyard. Nia chopped wood, patched the roof, and reattached the wind chime made of deer bones and old iron spoons. Every time the wind blew, the sound echoed like a call from a faraway place, gentle and persistent. We don't have much. A small table, 2 wooden bowls, a few books with chipped spines, but never have I felt so full. Not for material things, but for the first time, I get to look at someone every morning and not be afraid of something being taken away. One evening, as I was sorting through my old rags, I found a small piece of wood, something Nia had left with me. Long ago, on the back porch of the Beckley Inn, on it was carved a single word, enough, enough. I touched the carving, and my heart suddenly felt warm like the firewood. When I turned around, he was standing in the doorway, his hair tied back, his shirt still covered in sawdust. In his hands was a loaf of fresh bread, fragrant, cracked, wrapped in a piece of cloth I had sewn for my dress. I took it, smiling. "You always bring warm bread," I said. He shrugged, a rare smile in his eye. "Because you always make it disappear." I sat down on the wooden bench, tore off a small piece, and chewed slowly. Not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to retain the taste of what had saved me. Not just the bread, but what lay behind it. Kindness, unconditional. "Nut," I called, my voice low. He looked up. "That night, why didn't you let me take the cake and go? Why did you stop me?" He leaned against the doorframe, eyes looking out into the forest. "Because someone gave me cake," he said slowly, and didn't ask where I was from. I was silent. Something slowly welled up inside me. Not tears, but gratitude. For him, for the person who had given me the cake, for myself, for not giving up. I think, I said softly, that saved me more than the cake. He nodded slightly. Outside, the dusk turned the forest to honey and burnt earth. A light wind blew, carrying the scent of smoke, damp wood, and something like hope. There we sat, 2 people who had been turned away by the world. But now, in the house we had built with our own hand, with a warm cake on the table, and a silence that needed no explanation, I knew I was home, and if anyone asks, I won't talk about what we lost. I'll tell you what we found. A place where no one asks where you're from. A name that's called with respect. And a look that's like a smoldering fire never burning, but never going out. A roof, one hand, and a promise that sometimes the world can change from just one loaf of bread and one person who doesn't leave.